Landlord maliciously complianced themselves, by user Vikings. This happened a few years ago, in my last apartment. My roommate and I were living in a basement place with upstairs neighbors, and the owner decided he wanted to sell. The upstairs neighbors ended up buying it, and became our new landlords. And they were awful at it. I could fill a whole post with the amount of stuff they tried to get away with, but we're here to talk about one particular instance. But suffice to say, they had no idea that landlords had responsibilities and simply saw us tenants as a source of income that should be ever growing, hence our rent suddenly spiking, and why we left. But there was one time they maliciously complianced themselves. See, they had a habit of trying to push stuff on us that was blatantly illegal. Their first contract, for example, said among other things that they had the right to enter the apartment at any time they wanted and could go through our stuff if they wished because we were living on their property. I pointed out that this was highly illegal, and they grew very upset, saying, "Well, we'll see about that." This clause later suddenly became the real one before we signed. One day, however, our lone fire alarm stopped working. As dutiful tenants, we reached out and said, "Hey, the fire alarm stopped working." Their response was a predictable sort of "So what? We need to have a working fire alarm," we replied. "And it's the landlord's duty to provide working fire alarms." "No, it's not. You want one, you get it. The law says otherwise." And here's where they maliciously complianced themselves. Possibly because they were getting tired of being corrected, they got snooty with this one. We got a very sarcastic response. "Oh, it does it? Well, we'll just see what the fire marshal has to say about that." Me and my roommate, upon receiving this message, burst out laughing. But they were serious. They thought they were going to contact the fire marshal, he was going to side with them, and then they could come down on us hard. I don't know what their expressions were when we said, "Okay, yeah, do that." However, the next morning there's frantic knocking at our door. There's the landlord and his family, looking very concerned, with a bag of brand new fire alarms, one for each room and IIRC even 2 spares. He begs to be let in outside of the 24-hour notice, and says it's an emergency, he has to put these alarms up right now. Trying not to laugh, we let them in, and they hurriedly put one in every single room, apologizing profusely for the delay and telling us if you need anything, don't hesitate to ask. I don't know how that meeting with the fire marshal went, or if they got him or someone else at their office, but their attitude painted a pretty clear picture of the ultimate result. They complied maliciously, thinking they'd called our bluff. Whoops! Can't be 2 minutes late, by user Pandora Enters. Long-time lurker and first-time poster on this sub. Sorry for any mistakes, English isn't my native language. So I used to work for this terrible manager in a pharmacy, let's call him Edwin. He was the kind of guy who wanted is to greet every client in an insanely busy store. He was the type that wanted to introduce a color wheel for when I made creams and such, and he was an overall terrible person. Edwin was the type that didn't let me go to a funeral of a friend of mine who died at 23 and the next day he could leave because he had to walk his dog. After a few years I was done with all that shit. The last figurative drop? Him giving me this lecture in front of our patients when I was late because a bus broke down and I couldn't let in. He told me, "Work hours are from 9 to 12 and from 1 to 6:30. Got it, mate?" I stopped going to the lessons we got from people during my break. And got on at exactly 9 to clock in. When he commented that I usually was early, I told him, "You said my hours are between 9 and 6:30. No exceptions." Gave him a confused look. So whenever I was helping a patient, I would drop everything and stop at that exact hour. He fired me, I went to the union and was paid for 2 more years by this pharmacy. Later I learned, that during Corona, he made his people work with that virus. So what did I do? I called my county's FDA and told them all about it. The pharmacy is still shut down. Politicians ignore warnings about publishing everyone's data online, by user Tunderpants. Back when every business and government was starting to get their services accessible online for the first time, there was a new law passed in my state that all local government public records must be accessible via the web. Those records held by local government included dog registrations, building plans/permits, property ownership information, etc. Until this point, you had to physically turn up at the local government offices and have your name recorded to access such information, but it was free to access and they were not permitted to deny you. At the time I was the webmaster for one of the local government areas in Australia. When this was first proposed, we highlighted that residents would be very upset by making this information easier to access, and potentially for people to scrape the entire dataset. Tests to prove you were human were not very reliable back then. This was politics, so we were somewhat surprised that the politicians didn't see the potential public backlash. We also wanted to protect our residents from people who would try to abuse or profit from mass access to this information. Our warnings were ignored. So we complied, maliciously. I wrote an absolutely brilliant information portal, with the best CAPTCHA we could implement at the time, which complied exactly with what the law required. We ensured the local newspaper knew the exact date and time it would go online and what would be published. It was easy to find and put in a lot of time to ensure news media would be able to easily demonstrate the potential harm. The following day, front page news about the massive privacy issues this could pose. That morning, we were told to take it offline and it stayed offline permanently. The portal was up for a total of 27 hours. In the aftermath, politicians tried to shift the blame to our local government leadership, who shifted it to us in the IT department. We had prepared a paper trail to ensure that those truly responsible were given all the credit for the project. And those who rebuffed our warnings, had their emails included in the Freedom of Information requests made during the investigation. You want us to refer to you by your job title? Okay then, by user FLitsML. TLDR at bottom, generally SFW. In a previous role I came across the epitome of manglement. A young twat who'd been smarmy enough to work his way into a leadership role, without ever having to actually do the job he was managing. Unsurprisingly, he was less than effective. To use his words, we were the skilled team that worked for him. He was in the management. There are a few stories I can share about this dick, including one where he said I was too attractive to do my job, but that's for another time. This particular anecdote was when the previous leader left, and we ended up with him. Our new leader was quite particular about his role. He wasn't just a leader, he was a production leader. He was quite insistent we called him by his job title, to the extent that he moaned when we said, "Oh, the gaffer says XYZ, nope, it must be the production leader says XYZ. Please respect his job, thanks." I assume this was his pretentious effort to seem important. Remember I said he'd never worked the job before? He never quite understood the details of what he was asking, and you could see his eyes glaze over and his mind wander to KPIs and metrics whenever someone said, that won't work, we need to do ABC first before we throw this job onto the machines. For the most part, we just worked it out ourselves and did what we could, and explained what we couldn't. More glazing over and thoughts of metrics and checkboxes followed. His general demeanor didn't really sit well with us, especially how he thought he was better than the grunts working the job. The one thing that sticks in my mind is that the previous boss, who had retired, used to say our team, the new guy said my team. Small difference but it speaks volumes. So, we decided to maliciously comply. You want to be called by your job title, sure. We can do that. However, we abbreviate everything. Including your job title, production leader, operations. That abbreviated to PL, Ops. Which abbreviated to PLOPS. I can't take credit for the nickname, but it spread super quick. The malicious compliance was embedded. Within 36 hours, every shift knew that we had to follow PLOP's orders. For non-English speakers, PLOP is an onomatopoeic way of describing the act of passing feces. PLOPS was obviously quite unhappy with his new nickname. Just imagine the most nasally voice ever saying I am a production leader to a group of guys, most of which had been in the trade since before PLOPS was born, and you've got a good idea of how well respected PLOPS ended up being. For the rest of his short career in that role, we called him PLOPS. It infuriated him. To give you an example of a typical incident, 3 of the shop floor guys are stood in the middle of the factory talking. PLOPS sees this and walks over to chastise them for not working. PLOPS, excuse me, gents. Guy number 1, what's up, PLOPS? PLOPS, I'm a production leader. Why aren't you on your machines? Guy number 2, we're trying to figure out how to do the job. PLOPS, what? Aren't you trained for this? Guy number 1, we are, PLOPS. Been doing this for 24 years. PLOPS, but th. Guy number 2, the problem is, PLOPS, we have 4 sets of tooling available. Each job requires 2 sets of tools per machine, and as there are 3 of us, we would need pauses sarcastically to count 6 sets of tools. PLOPS, nobody told me that. Guy number 3, yes, because we normally split the job out by individual tasks. Number 1 can process the tasks that don't need tooling, then split the tasks between number 2 and number 3. It doesn't matter what order these are done in, so we split the batches 2:1 then swap. Do you have a better solution? Plops, no, do that. Guy number 1, thanks for your advice, Plops. Plops walked away looking very red, with the guys bursting out laughing whilst still very much in earshot. Plops complained numerous times, and the chief of production told us off in a very half-arsed way. We later found out he also hated Plops for consistently bringing his nickname up and expecting something to be done, often telling him that this wasn't a school and to just play along and it'll naturally go away. Fast forward to one day when Plops was late for a site-wide meeting. He entered the room, to be met with 2 or 3 voices chastising him with comments such as "What time do you call this, Plops?" and "Good grief, it's Plops o'clock." Turning a now familiar shade of crimson, he opened his mouth, but then noticed the Director of Operations, DOPS, stood at the front, having paused his speech. Plops shut his mouth, and quickly found a seat. The director continued for a bit, before pausing to ask if anybody had any questions. Plops' hand immediately shot up. "Apologies for being late, but I had a question about the half-year business projections given the ramp-up in production. Was this already covered or is this a good time to ask the question?" This question had absolutely nothing to do with anything we did, and it was painfully obvious Plops was just asking the question to seem even more pretentious than he normally was. The director replied, "Not a problem, Plops. Maybe save that one for the end." This was too much for everybody else, who burst out laughing. The director didn't know who Plops was and had assumed that was his name. The director innocently asked, "Oh, is that not his name?" Someone explained it was a nickname, he was called John. The director apologized and Plops, presumably trying to hide his embarrassment, said "Don't worry, it wasn't an important question." After the meeting Plops excused himself and we didn't see him for the rest of the day. He was back in the following day, with an even more sour face than normal. We were all still giddy about how the director had called him Plops, so we just gave him a wide berth. A few days later, when the atmosphere had calmed down, Plops announced at a meeting that he'd accepted a similar role at another site and would be transferring in the next week. We then found out that Plops had complained yet again, about a director, no less, to the chief, who had now got fed up of having to baby the kid, and had had a quiet word with the director. Said director, presumably wanting to save face a little, advised that another production lead at a different facility was going on maternity leave so Plops could be parachuted into that role fairly easily. They then had the best part of a year to find somewhere else for him. We weren't sad to see Plops go, but he forgot to bring in cakes on his last day. So, one of the guys who'd worked with some of the staff in the new facility made a phone call. From what I understand, Plops' outgoing counterpart introduced him at one of their morning meetings and invited him to speak. He said, "Good morning, I'm John and I'll be taking over from Lisa whilst she's off. I am an experienced production leader so I'm hoping we can keep the wheels turning whilst Lisa and I make the transition. Wishing her the best with the baby and for new parent life." A chorus of voices came from across the room. "Well said, Plops." We eventually got a new production leader, who'd worked in a similar role at another company. He seemed to be a decent guy. At his first meeting, he introduced himself and brought in a crate of homemade samosas. He said he didn't want to intrude on our workstations unnecessarily and thus asked everybody to pop into his office at some point in the next day or two to introduce themselves and have a 5 to 10 minute chat. I was nominated by the guys to go first, and report back how he was. I summarized his personality with one observation, before I'd even sat down. I walked over to the office door and knocked. He waved at me to come in, and as my gaze went upwards, I noticed the new sign he'd put on the door. Plops office. TLDR, new boss insists on being called production leader. We work in operations. Put the two together, production lead, operations. We abbreviated it to Plops, much to his disdain. He forgot to buy leaving cakes so we made sure the nickname followed him. Edited to add the final paragraph, above the TLDR. I made my own schedule, by user Conchetta Baby. I work the night shift as a cashier at a 24/7 convenience store. My shift is from 10 p.m. to 5:30 a.m. Usually my coworker and I switch tasks. Like she's at the counter while I help the customers. Lately I've been dealing with constant headaches so I asked our manager if I could take a night off. But instead of approving it, she snapped. If you don't like the schedule, make your own. So I did. I skipped 2 nights, then worked only 4 hours on the 3rd night, and took another night off after that. When I finally came back, she scolded me, saying, "That's not what I meant." I told her, "Well, you said make my own schedule, so I did." Now the whole staff, whether day shift or night shift, is asking if they can customize their schedules too. Funny how she suddenly cares about clear communication. Shout out to our manager of the year, ma'am knows it all. P.S. I did put my phone to DND so that I won't notify with her calls and texts. Also, our manager only go to the store every Monday. I asked her Monday night. My working days are Monday to Saturday.